Hello, welcome to the lecture, Classroom Environments. I'm Cynthia McCallister. The objective of this lecture is to help you see how the classroom environment itself can be a potent educational resource for students. In it, I present a couple theoretical concepts to help you think about classroom environments, and I also suggest procedures to help you create rich learning environments in your classrooms. First, I want to share a quote from the anthropologist RUTH BENEDICT that will help provide a mindset for thinking about rich learning environments. She wrote, "His culture provides the raw material of which the individual makes his life. If it is meager, the individual suffers. If it is rich, the individual has the chance to rise to his opportunity." For those of us raised on the idea that learning is a product of transmission, the sum of knowledge we had learned from our teachers, the idea that the environment has a role in what a person learns can seem at first confusing. Those of us who attended formal schooling sat at desks lined up in rows, where our personal space amounted to the area occupied by our body and the desktop and the cubicle airspace above the desktop. The remaining space in the classroom belonged to the teacher and was governed through her authority. If it is assumed that knowledge can be transmitted from one person into the head of another, then the allocation of space I just described makes perfect sense. In the scenario when the pathway of knowledge runs along a one-way trajectory from teacher authority into the heads of students, it seems only logical that their heads and bodies be ordered efficiently in such rows before the teacher. This was what the ancients thought, and how classrooms have been organized ever since. You can travel to the most remote village in any corner of the globe, step into a classroom, and find the same structure. It's almost astonishing that the world's cultures could be so vastly diverse and express diversity in such different cultural practices, from religion to political systems to family organization, and yet have in common such a strikingly similar structure of formal education. These similarities probably relate back to the conception of knowledge that's governed philosophy since the Greeks. Thinking is an internal, individual process. But as we have learned in previous lectures, knowledge is not transmitted in a linear manner. It's the product of relational, dynamic, and self-initiated social processes. In light of these insights, how do we use classroom space to promote learning in the best possible way? This lecture sets out to answer that very question. The environment is the medium for learning. Remember the petri dishes you used in high school biology class? A circular plate lined with agar jelly that nourished bacteria and other microscopic organisms? Well, think of the classroom as a petri dish for learning culture students. It's the medium that nourishes growth. And to paraphrase the quote from RUTH BENEDICT at the beginning of the lecture, if it is rich, they will flourish, but if it is meager, they will starve. As you listen to this lecture, challenge yourself to think about your own classroom environment. Take ideas from the lecture and use them to figure out how you can make your classroom rich. So here are some conceptual tools we'll use to understand the role of the environment. Vygotsky's well-known concept of the zone of proximal development is commonly used to refer to learning that can potentially unfold given the right circumstances. The zone is defined as the actual development level as determined by independent problem solving, and the level of potential development as determined through problem solving under adult guidance or in collaboration with more capable peers. The zone of proximal development, then, refers to any of the possible developmental outcomes present in a cultural situation in which a learner is engaged. It's an acronym that represents potential. But in order to understand the full potential of learning within the zone of proximal development, it's helpful to more deeply explain some related concepts. Jan Valsener, a student of Vygotsky, wrote, quote, "The developing child is conceptualized in the context of his relationship with the culturally and physically structured environment, where the child's actions upon that environment are guided by assistance from other human beings, parents, siblings, peers, teachers, etc. The particular physical structure of the environment of a human child is set up by the activities of other human beings and modified by them over time." End quote. Felsener build on the concept of the zone by describing other learning zones. He proposes two that I'll describe now. First, the zone of free movement. The zone of free movement is the cognitive structure of the person-environment relationship that's socially constructed. So, in a classroom, space is carved up and used in certain ways, usually determined by the teacher. Thus, the classroom environment is created by the teacher. But this environment is the arena of action on the part of the student. The student is the agent of activity within the arena. Thus, the zone of free movement is created by the student. If you attended high school in classrooms where seats were lined up in rows, your zone of free movement was confined to the space in which you were permitted to move between the starting and ending bells of class. These boundaries were socially imposed by the teacher. But if, sitting at my desk, in my rows, in my assigned seat, I decide to draw in my notebook, I'm taking agency to determine the bounds of my zone of free movement. Here's another example. When I was an elementary teacher, I'd take my students out for recess. School authorities created the boundaries of space. Our playground was a rectangular space behind the school, encircled by a wire fence in the back side of the building. Students in my class inherited the social knowledge of the playground boundaries the first week they arrived at school. But when they played tag or jumped rope, they enacted their zone of free movement within the sanctioned space of the playground. According to Felsener, the zone of free movement is both social and cognitive. It's social because others determine its boundaries, but it is cognitive because it's created by the learner when he or she actively determines the boundaries within the space. The second concept is the zone of possible action. The zone is comprised by the activities that are promoted within the zone of free movement. It's defined by those with power like the teacher or parent or group leader, but it's mutual in the way it functions. So, for example, if I place Lincoln logs on the carpet during choice time, I might be promoting building as an activity. But one of my students might use the logs to symbolize race cars or superheroes and use the logs differently. I'm promoting one action, but the student's taking another course. Or the high school science teacher might make the internet available to students during work time for the purpose of researching cells. But a student might decide to use the internet instead to go shopping for sneakers. In my high school classes, teachers stood at the front of the class lecturing, and by doing so they were promoting a responsive action on the part of students to listen and attend to what was being said. Some kids took part in the action promoted by the teacher, and others didn't. Some listened, took notes, participated, others drew. Some kids put their heads down and slept through class. As Felsener and his colleagues wrote, quote, "Development is seen as emerging through the activity of a person as she tries to adjust to situations, remembering and anticipating, in interactions with others and the world. All this takes place through constant meaning-making, semiotic attractors emerging from the self-organization of the past and present experiences. We literally go through the world creating meaning out of anything, or sometimes out of seemingly nothing." End quote. To Felsener, the concept of the zone of proximal development is, quote, "a set of possible next states of the developing system relationship within the environment." End quote. The zone of proximal development depends on what actions are promoted and how the student uses his or her own freedoms to engage within the environment. As Felsener suggests, the three zones converge to create a constellation of possible forms of novel growth. Learning is active and self-directed. As teachers, we need to learn how to work the zone of promoted action so that students achieve their potential. A teacher can direct a course of action, but the learner can respond in any number of ways. They can acquiesce, ignore, hesitate, resist, object. Unless students feel compelled to take part in the promoted action, learning goals can't be achieved. That was a lot of new information to take in, so let's take a few minutes to process it. I'll suggest an activity, and I'll describe it here. Start by thinking about your own classroom. Your students will have about 40 to 50 minutes of work time. What zones are they going to occupy during this period? Start by making a sketch of your classroom space. Then make a list of developmental targets you want them to eventually achieve. In any teacher's classroom, there are many, an infinite number of possibilities. But for now, for this activity, just think about 3 or 4 targets. These targets can represent the outer reaches, what Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development, the things that they can eventually do. Now think about the boundaries of the environment you established in your classroom. How do you suspect students will use these areas freely, when they exercise their freedom, to create their own zones of free movement? What rules and procedures establish these boundaries, and how are you going to make them clear and transparent to students? How are you going to ensure that when they use their freedom to create zones of free movement, the movement and actions they're engaging in help them reach the targets of the zone of proximal development? Now think about what kinds of promoted actions you believe kids need to engage in order to reach these targets. List some, and then think about ways you can help to ensure that, given freedom, your students will engage in the activities you promote. In the next lecture, we'll explore more deeply other facets of the classroom environment and how it relates to learning.